Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Robert Myers. I'm a landscape architect working both here in Cambridge, so our office on the right. We live underneath Nicholas Ray Architects in our little studio there, and also in our little wooden shed in Herefordshire where I live. It's a long story, and we don't really have time, but suffice to say I spend an unhealthy amount of time on the A14. We get ourselves involved with a wide range of projects, both in the public realm and for private clients. This is perhaps one of our better known projects. This is the Duke of York Square in Chelsea, a public space which we designed about 15 years ago for the Cadogan estate. And here in Cambridge, we work for a number of institutional clients as well as the university. This is a project for the American government, the American Cemetery in Madingley, where we worked on the design of a new visitors centre set within an ancient woodland. We undertake quite a range of projects for the colleges. This is the new courtyard that completed the Gilbert Scott Master Plan at Lerner Court for Clare College. And we have a long-term involvement on the backs in Cambridge. We prepared a landscape strategy a number of years ago, and that's an ongoing project looking at the design and management of the trees on the backs. We've got involved with quite a number of the new developments here in Cambridge. This is one of our projects at North West Cambridge. Deep involvement with sustainable drainage and public space in that project. And of course the notorious CB1 project, which you all know and love, where we've been involved for longer than I care to remember on the master plan, going back to the days of Richard Rogers, and now seeing it built out, including of course Station Square, which is now half complete, which is where we really first came across the concept of shared space, which is the subject that I want to talk about today. And in the course of designing the new square, we worked with and consulted with one of the proponents of shared space in this country, who is Ben Hamilton Bailey, who is the man on the right taking a little nap in one of his schemes up in Poynton, demonstrating how safe it is. And some of those principles have actually found their way through into the design for Station Square that you see today. And the concept of shared space is a really interesting one that I'm personally very excited about. And it was really the brainchild of this bearded man on the left, Hans Monderman, who was a Dutch highway engineer. Actually, he wasn't even just a highway engineer, he was actually a highway safety engineer for his sins. And he was working on some schemes in northern Holland. Budgets were tight, and he had a rather radical idea that perhaps, in terms of trying to improve safety, he turned ideas on their heads really, and came up with this disarmingly simple idea that actually perhaps instead of trying to add, as he says here, the trouble with traffic engineers is that when there's a problem with a road, they always try and add something. To my mind, it's much better to try and remove things. So he had this idea that actually, if you remove traffic lights, if you remove zebra crossings, take out lane markers, remove curbs, and create these shared spaces, so that actually people have to negotiate their way through streets by interacting with and reacting to one another. So the idea is that you react to one another, you don't wait for instructions from traffic lights, you don't necessarily keep within your white line. So rather than being told what to do, you have to start thinking for yourself and negotiate rights of way with pedestrians and with cyclists. As he put it, a wide road with lots of signs is saying, go ahead, don't worry, go as fast as you want, there's no need to pay attention to your surroundings. And he felt that was a very dangerous message. So his idea in a nutshell was to simplify streets, to remove clutter, to take away elements like curbs and traffic lights. And in so doing, the exciting thing I think from a design point of view is that you can then create much more beautiful places that are unencumbered by a lot of clutter, where you can pave across the road surface, you can remove curbs, and people can start to actually re-engage with the street and to live in the street again, which I think is something we've rather forgotten how to do. So this is a diagram produced by Ben Hamilton Bailey, which sort of summarises that quite neatly. I think the idea you go from all this clutter and danger and chaos and confusion, and you arrive at a place where actually cars and people can occupy streets at the same time, and where you have a much simplified urban realm. People actually think for themselves, and the world is a happier place. That's been taken up in part by publications such as this. So this is from Manual for Streets. It talks about this balance between movement status and place status. So clearly when you're on a motorway, the idea of shared space doesn't really make sense. It's all about movement and taking down barriers and letting pedestrians wander across the street would be inappropriate. But actually when it comes to places for people, it's clear that if a street doesn't perform well for people wishing to spend time in it, it's an indication that its place status, its place function is low. And there's a sort of continuum where between the conventional engineered road solutions, curbs, pedestrian barriers, vehicles restricted to parts of the street by bollards and railings, a rather poor quality or unwelcoming public space where you're just moving through with conventional road signs and traffic signals, through to a completely sort of hardcore shared space design where you take out all the curbs, you have paving from building to building, you take out pedestrian barriers, and you actually maybe even introduce elements such as cafes and seating and planting and art into the streetscape without road markings or traffic signals. And if you have crossings, they're just what's known as courtesy crossings, where you imply a crossing with a change of material. And in between that, obviously, you've got a state where you can have, you can remove clutter, but perhaps you don't go the whole hog. So here are some of the ideas about how you might be able to do that. This is in the case of an intersection, and things like removing signs, putting in art, lighting to illuminate both the pedestrian realm and the highway, actually moving things into the road, and making people actually make eye contact, so that pedestrians and vehicles are actually negotiating with each other by actually communicating and looking at each other in the eye, rather than just cars just moving through obeying road signs. Taking out curbs, another way to do that. So in a sense, it's a question of it actually introducing an element of confusion for the motorists, so that they slow down and actually look at their surroundings and drive in accordance with their environment, rather than some instruction from a highway engineer. And it's based on the idea of what's known as the risk compensation effect in psychology, the idea that people typically adjust their behaviour in response to a perceived level of risk, becoming more careful when they sense greater risk, and less careful if they feel that they're actually more protected. So for example, if you're driving at 70 miles an hour down the motorway, you take your seatbelt off, your instinct is actually to slow down. And they discovered that when anti-lock brakes came in, people tended to drive closer to the car in front of them because they felt protected, they felt safe. So this idea of shared space is really turning that on its head and saying, actually, if we increase the perceived level of risk, people will drive more carefully. So to summarise, we're really trying to get rid of things like shown in this image on the left, to actually remove all these street signs and clutter, to improve the quality of the public realm. So some examples of this. Clearly the idea of shared space is not a new one. Historically, streets were where people lived out their daily lives, where trade and transport mingled, where people actually met. And that's something that, with the rise of the motor car, has been slightly lost. Shared spaces also come about without designers being involved. This is a scene in Tokyo, where commerce and life spills out onto the street. Vehicles, traders and pedestrians mix quite happily. We all know examples of shared spaces in cities, such as the sort of typical Muse Street, cars, pedestrians. It's a slow-speed environment where cars and pedestrians happily mix. And this concept's been picked up in more recent developments. For example, at Accordia, the Muse is quite a strong typology. The idea of shared spaces, or home zones as we might call them here, started life perhaps pre-Hans Monderman in Holland. The idea of the Woonerf, where cars are restricted by law to travel at a walking pace. Here you can see on the left, actually there's children's play in the street, tree planting, seats, bicycle racks, all aimed to sow a bit of confusion in the motorist's mind and slow traffic down. This is not a conventional shared space, but it's an interesting example of pedestrians sort of colonising the street. In Tokyo, there should be a crossing. All the lights go red at once, and there's a surge of literally thousands of people crossing the street and occupying the street for a few moments. And that is something that was sort of picked up in the recent redesign of Oxford Circus in London, where there's a similar diagonal crossing being introduced, which is quite a novel idea, so that actually it's a much more pedestrian-friendly environment. And similarly at Kensington High Street in London, not a hardcore shared space, but quite a revolutionary idea at the time, to take down barriers and street clutter, and actually to create a much higher quality pedestrian environment where people can cross the street where they wish, and creating a much better environment for the public. And at Exhibition Road, this is a scheme that Ben Hamilton Bailey was involved with, a recent scheme where actually it's no longer a conventional road, pedestrians come first. The diagonal diamond shapes in the paving sort of reflect the human nature to cross street at angles. Leonard Circus in Shoreditch, the most awful gyratory transformed into this new shared space, with deliberately confusing tree planting and paving replacing a conventional roundabout. The entrance to Sloane Square in London on the left here, pedestrians surging in and out of the tube station. Curbs have been eliminated. The road is still marked with a flush curb, but actually pedestrians take the lead. Cars are there, but pedestrians are in charge. And at 7 Dials in London, again, this is a busy roundabout, but actually it's also a very successful public space, which at quiet times is occupied in a social way. In Ashford in Kent, again, very busy, conventional highways replaced with shared space. You can see there on the left the idea of trying to narrow the visual width of the road using paving, and again on the right the same idea there. So it's at Widemark Street in Hereford, where the idea is to change roads into streets and to create spaces and moments along that street to slow traffic. New Road in Brighton, similarly, transforming a rather derelict street into what is now a very popular destination in Brighton by, in a way, cars are welcome in the street, but they're there on people's terms. And this similarly scheme in Dublin, outside the old GPO building, where a road, a busy artery through Dublin, has been transformed just at this moment into a place. With the planting of those pleached limes, a square has been created, the road has been resurfaced, so although buses and traffic still pass through this space, it's actually become a place that relates to the architecture surrounding it rather than simply a sea of tarmac. Some interesting examples in New Zealand, Elliott Street and O'Connell Street, and this is interesting I think because they've used street furniture and tree planting to actually subdivide the space. You've got the road notionally running through the centre, but actually pedestrians seeking refuge and trying to find their way through the space can use the building edge and the street furniture to navigate. And we can also use contrasting paving materials and textures to achieve the same thing. Castle Square in Carnarvon, here what was just a traditional tarmac car park transformed with new paving planting, so that actually when the cars aren't there, you haven't got all the sort of normal highway infrastructure, red, white lines and signage. Actually it's a rather serene, simple shared space. So what of Cambridge? Cambridge is perhaps a little bit of a late adopter to shared space. It's difficult to think of any, as I say, sort of hardcore schemes in the city. The historic core of Cambridge has a number of spaces and streets that are semi-vehicle free, which function as shared spaces with shallow or no curbs, with paving materials taken across the street. This is an example recently implemented at Tennyson Road near our office in Cambridge, where this sort of circular paving pattern has been deliberately introduced following the principles of shared space, which sort of confuses the driver and causes them to slow down on this awkward junction. And last but not least, of course, Station Square, where we have tried to create a unified palette of materials across the public realm, tying those bands of paving and the paving materials from pavement into the street, and on the right showing how we've used street furniture to, again, and change of paving material to create a route around the outside of the space for those who find it difficult to navigate. Some of the more recent schemes in Cambridge, this is Allies and Morrison scheme at Trumpington Meadows. This is effectively a shared space. We've lost the curbs. We have tree planting in the street. And so these sort of residential schemes, they're shared spaces. Traffic at low volumes, low speeds works very well. And just to finish, this isn't really a shared space, but this is Mill Road during the winter fair. It is just so wonderful when traffic is removed to see people reoccupying the street, even for just for one day. So, to conclude, I think shared space is a very exciting idea that helps to improve public safety, and that creates much better environments for us. It doesn't work everywhere, and we shouldn't try to make it. Hans Monderman made no claim that his principles of shared space would apply universally. The shared spaces, slow-speed environments, need to be part of a network of well-organised highway systems. As he said, the slow network needs the fast network to work. It works much better where traffic levels are low and traffic is slow. Generally speaking, when levels of traffic are above about 100 vehicles per hour, pedestrians treat the general path taken by motor vehicles as a road to be crossed rather than a space to occupy. So we need to try and get traffic levels down, and we need to try and slow the traffic. We need to consult during these schemes, particularly with the public and with disabled groups, in order to bring them with us and to understand the particular difficulties which certain groups will have. But I hope that this is something that will pique your interest, and we can discuss it further later, and I hope it's something that becomes more common in Cambridge in the future. Thank you.